Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading video for Monday, June 24th, 2024. This seems to be where we are now, with the month ticking away from us. Well, last AM reading video, I talked about actually having a federal holiday off and hopefully, making a dent in my reading. And I definitely, have been reading and things have been happening. Maybe not as much as I hoped, but, basically, if I'm very lucky, I suppose I can say that I'll get to 10 of the 12 books I intended to this month, but at least a few of them are here now for me to talk about, so here we go. As always with these AM reading videos, I'm going to start with a short story, and I am currently reading from Pembrooke magazine's issue number 55. And this week I read the short story Something's Happened by Zach Swiss, which I really liked this story, even if it kind of took place in two timelines. And it follows a group of people who work for an American firm that I can't remember more specifically what it really is they work for, but they are in Tajikistan. In the one timeline, they're just sort of talking about the weird reality of being in this foreign country and the disconnect in a way from the corporate culture, but also the disconnect from the culture of the country, and they're just sort of trying to make their way and see what they think about all this foreignness. And then the second storyline of sorts, that's just smaller italics inserts, something has already happened and they're already home and sort of like looking back with strangeness onto, escaping with their lives and trying to see the experience in a different way. And then in the Tajikistan storyline, we get to the point where there is a uprising of some sort, but we see it from the perspective of these employees and their families who are mostly like going through their normal days, and the big thing is that the internet goes out or something, which is actually kind of normal, so it takes a little while for them to actually realize that something has happened, and ultimately they're evacuated by the American embassy. But yeah, it's a interesting tale. Like it gets into just the weird awkwardness of being part of a nation that's in a tumultuous time within itself, and being these outsiders, and just sort of the weirdness of being outsiders, and I feel like a little bit of criticism of corporate culture, which I'm always cool with. And I thought the cadence, and what was happening that we knew of, even when you don't know much, within the story, was just very intriguing. Next, I finished The Phoenix Bride by Natasha Siegel, although I don't feel like I have much more to say about it than I said last time. This is 17th century historical fiction, Jewish historical fiction, published this year, where we are following two people in London. One of them is a, Anglican woman of means who is trying to is getting married off somewhat forcibly by her sister, but she actually falls in love with her doctor. This woman, Cecilia, her doctor is David Mendes, who is a Portuguese Jew who has immigrated to England because England opened its border to Jews for the first time in 400 years, and because the Inquisition is raging in Spain and Portugal. So we follow them, and a lot of it is about their, very burgeoning love affair with one another in a society where obviously they would not be allowed or to marry and kind of stay as they are. It's an interesting sort of thing where there's a lot of like anachronism sort of feeling in this story, that maybe some of their attitudes, and there's also like a queer subplot with David being bisexual. That the way she writes it feels more, modern, but the story is still engaging enough. I think most people would, let it go and just, come along for the ride. The way she describes London is actually quite beautiful, and like she sees the beauty in the city during a time when mostly I think of plagues and fires, but she actually sees a place where people might want to live, and so that was intriguing as well. So there were some great details to it. I probably would have been happier with a little more focus on the Jewish stuff and David's Jewish identity and what it meant for him, but although there was some. Yeah, it was a fun story to read. It does have a little bit of a happy ending, although it's not a romance, and I guess doesn't traditionally end how romances might, but it's a happier ending than, one might assume if in most historical fiction of this nature, which, maybe is also just something that's nice to read as well. Next, I read A Call from Spooner Street by Carol Ascher, because this was one of the books I put on my Goodreads TBR years ago after it was reviewed on the Jewish Book Council, and then it made it to the top of my Goodreads TBR, and I have a resolution to read those books. And it's a small house publication from Mill City Press. I'm always thrilled to, give a few indie presses some attention sometimes, and I'm grateful that the Jewish Book Council put this on my radar, but at the same time, I thought it was a little bit middling. Ultimately, there were some interesting things, but we kind of jumped into it with too many names and too many associations, and I felt like I didn't fully care about the characters. Especially in the beginning. But this story chronicles a middle-aged woman named Marlene, and she finds out her estranged father, who is a Holocaust survivor and German literature professor. He is dying of cancer, and she's living in New York, and he's in Madison, Wisconsin, and she's flying back and forth to take care of him. And there are some beautiful relationships that ultimately we get to see. That after a while, I guess I got into the story a bit more, and it was more touching. There was Raoul, who is Peter, the dying professor's Santa Dominican caretaker, who he himself has HIV, and it becomes like a really intimate relationship between him and Marlene, and also, Raoul, Marlene, and Peter, like how, caring for one another, and Raoul also has a partner, and he's comes into the mix as well, and then there is Marlene's son, Noah, who was more absent for longer than I thought. He was doing aid work in Africa, but he is able to also have a goodbye with his grandfather, which, that part is a little, I guess the part that I was invested in the least, or the fact that Marlene was seeing a new man, and Noah was trying to get to know about his father, who he didn't grow up with, and I'm like kind of thinking, in one part, Marlene now has a rich backstory, but on the other part, it's, I don't know, things felt a little jam-packed in that way. I think also Ascher was coasting a little, I guess, on all of the German literature references, so probably someone with a history in that literature simply would get more out of the story, because it's such a big part, especially of Peter's identity, so that things I don't think get too schmaltzy even between him and Marlene, even though, they're apparently overcoming an estrangement. But I do feel like there is a lot in here about what it means to die, and what it means to be a family member, especially a daughter of someone who is dying, especially when you live far away. And these are things I've, had some access to, because, my mother's mother, when she was passing and she was getting more ill, my mother lives halfway across the country from where a lot of her family is, and now with my great aunt is in the same situation again. So, that stuff really rang true to me, the commentary on what it would be like for Peter as his faculties are going, and he's like this, just sort of stubborn, righteous sort of man. He's like definitively atheist, but then like we get into like questions of spirituality and faith, and like Raoul's Catholic upbringing and that sort of thing. The Judaism mostly is contained to the Holocaust, and him, also coming to terms with, Peter coming to terms with the home that he lost when he was a child. And there's a lot of immigrants in this story as well. And so, yeah, I think ultimately I thought there were some really moving parts to this, relationships and things that people were facing, but especially with some of Marlene's personal story, and in the beginning it was just like too much of a rush into things, and I didn't connect quite as much as I hoped to, but I don't know, now I'm starting to feel a little more forgiving as well. The next book that I've read is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, getting into a little nonfiction here. And this book I actually acquired through a scavenger hunt of banned books that the DC Public Library does many years. And this is a very harrowing book in terms of public policy. It's the sort of book where it is kind of dry and academic, so a lot of the specifics, I don't know, it's harder for me when it's not a narrative to remember a lot of the specifics, but certainly I could come away from this book with really the harrowing realization through a lot of evidence of how much the federal government and also, you know, smaller forms of government in the U.S. and for smaller municipalities very actively took a part in denying 14th Amendment rights to African Americans after Reconstruction. After the Civil War, there was actually a brief period where it seemed like, you know, after slavery, we would get to the point where African Americans would be treated more as equal citizens until white supremacy kind of clamped down on that. And there's a lot of emphasis even on Roosevelt and the New Deal and how much, in order to appease the white supremacy of the Southern Democrats at the time, he had to make sure that African Americans weren't included in so many of those programs. A lot of the focus is on housing and how African Americans were just excluded from a growing housing market, weren't able to get loans, weren't allowed, very actively were pushed out by the government, also, you know, by other sorts of violence, but often very much bolstered by the government, out of, you know, out of housing. You know, they weren't able to advance the same way white people were, and that very much, you know, contributed to the fact that the class structure in the U.S. is often on very racial lines right now, because, you know, these things aren't stagnant, and that generational wealth has grown in this country as, you know, certain people have been able to, you know, get in certain jobs and move into certain communities and, you know, be able to pass on wealth to their children, and it has not been equal. And that's why, even though a lot of these policies have been shifted now, it's too late in a way, because there's still class issues in play, where now there's just many African Americans that don't have the capital to, you know, take advantage now, because it is such a generational thing. You know, how capitalism works, really. Or, you know, doing well in capitalism works, I suppose, is it? Yeah, and I guess for me the most harrowing thing was to think of how active the government was in perpetuating all of this on all levels. And, you know, especially coming at this like as someone who believes, you know, most of my political belief is how the government is supposed to be here to help the people, and that I like the idea of government regulation when, you know, it's put in place against, you know, corporations and so forth that, you know, to my mind often are, you know, only seeing their bottom line and only acting out of greed a lot of times, but to think that also the government has been a problem in the past. And, you know, in some ways continues to be, because I think so many of these policies then became entrenched. Although, you know, this didn't really go into a lot of the whys of why things happened, other than, you know, just wanting to keep the races separate to make sure that white supremacy reigned, and that, you know, black people just couldn't get as far ahead and have the same rights. But, you know, it wasn't a psychology book of what racism is beyond the policies. So, yeah, a very harrowing book. And, you know, at the end there are some ideas of, you know, how to try to fix things, but mostly, you know, these problems are so entrenched that it would take a very long time to reach a better form of equity. And I mean, you know, there's a lot of people who believe in radical, you know, reactions, defund the police and that sort of stuff, which I don't think he goes into quite as much Rothstein does. But things would have to, there would have to be some pretty significant changes, and I think you would have to rely on the government ultimately and on providing aid, and that in this, you know, landscape would mean convincing Republicans that, I mean, his big argument is that this is de jure racism rather than de facto racism, that is that the government caused it, that it wasn't just because of, you know, decisions that black people made that, you know, left them in, you know, statistically in more impoverished conditions. And so you'd have to reframe it to say, we as a society, as a government, actually caused this, and that's how we would have to fix it. So yeah, I do. I guess, you know, for me, the problem basically with this nonfiction is just that it's can be very dry and can just be very difficult to, I mean, not only just emotionally, like, oh, this is just, you know, such a horrible part of history, but just difficult for me to, you know, latch on to all of these facts. But I did ultimately, I got the message. I think I got the message, and at least from what I can see, he was very much able to back up his message that, yes, the government was very directly involved in these actions. The next book I'm now in the middle of reading is A Snake Falls to Earth by Darcie Littlebadger, which is another one of the scavenger hunt books that I got from the DC Public Library last year. This is indigenous science fiction fantasy. It's really, I guess, a folklore retelling. And we're following two characters. One is Nina, who is a Lipan indigenous young girl living in Texas. We start when she's a preteen, and her great-grandmother dies, and it seems like her great-grandmother was very old, that's probably going to, you know, be more explained later in the story, I assume. And then we're just following the rest of her family. She recently saved a cat who was in distress. There was a little bit of like an altercation with a white man on her grandmother's land. There's, you know, commentary that all of her great-grandmother's descendants also lived a long time. This maybe is a little more technically of the weaker story, I suppose. The stronger one is that sort of in this mirror world where we're following Ali, who is a cottonmouth snake. But he and his kind, and I think most of the other animals in his world, can transform to their second form, which is a human form. But like he can be both. And I think he's supposed to be of an age with Nina, but he is forced to leave home because, you know, I guess in cottonmouth culture, this is when you know, strike out on your own. So his mother tells him he has to go. And he runs into problems almost immediately. He's the type of person who's like just doesn't feel ready yet to strike it out on his own, but he ultimately does. And he, you know, has some difficulties along the way where he, you know, makes some enemies by mistake, loses some supplies, but then he's able to settle down a little bit and seems like he's now in the process of making new friends with some coyote girls. And then there's some commentary as well, you know, about how the worlds interact with each other, and there's Ollie's tells us the story of how there was in his world like a bison, a kingdom, like or a city of like, you know, a huge amount of bison in the past, but they ultimately died out, and that was connected to the fate of the bison in our world, where in the U.S., speaking of more atrocious government action, the U.S. government killed off a lot of the bison because they were trying to force indigenous peoples off of their own land. And a great way to do that was to kill their major food source. So yeah, that's what's happening in this book, and I guess it's okay to maybe keep it that vague for now, and hopefully I'll report back on how things shake up at the end. And the final book I'm reading right now is Ice Palace by Edna Ferber. This is another one of my top of the Goodreads picks that I guess a few years ago or several years ago now I took some sort of, you know, Jewish women authors test, and I think it said that I'd prefer stories by Edna Ferber, who was a mid-20th century writer. I'm not sure even how much Judaism comes up in her works. I don't think it comes up in this one much at all, which this is, I think, from 1958, and it takes place in Alaska shortly before Alaska became a state. The main character in this story is named Christine Storm, which is kind of fun. We have like a woman with, I guess, a lot of spirit and personality to her, and her two grandfathers who have very different relationships with Alaska as well, and I assume things are just going to balloon in a sort of epic fashion from there. And here is the author actually standing in Alaska. So that about covers it for me now. I certainly feel like I had more to ramble about this week than last week at least. I also just recently turned on my AC because here in the DC area it's just getting too hot. So I guess the AC might be clicking on in some more of my videos, I suppose, unless I turn it off again, but it was a little too stifling in here. It was getting into the, I guess, mid-80s, and I'm like, it's time. So I hope you're all doing well with your reading and with the weather around you. I should be back on this channel hopefully pretty imminently to do my June book haul. I actually went out shopping yesterday as I'm filming this, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.